The sun had just begun to rise over the endless Arizona desert, spreading its golden light across the dry land. The air was cool, and a light breeze brushed against the sand and cactus needles. Thomas Blake sat by his campfire, rubbing his tired eyes. He had spent weeks driving cattle across the desert, and his body felt every mile of it. Thomas was a man of the frontier, tough, quiet, and used to being alone. He had learned long ago that life in the wild was not kind. The desert had no mercy, and neither did most people who lived in it. For years he had trusted only his horse, his rifle, and his instincts. He poured the last of his coffee from a tin pot and looked around his small camp. His saddle leaned against a rock, his blanket spread beside the dying fire, and his food bag lay near his feet. The world was still, except for the distant cry of a hawk. When he turned to feed his horse, something felt wrong. His eyes narrowed. The ground near his supplies looked disturbed. He walked closer and froze. The bag of food was gone. A sudden wave of anger rushed through him. Out here, food wasn't just comfort, it was survival. Someone had crept into his camp while he slept and stolen the only thing keeping him alive. He scanned the horizon, his sharp eyes catching faint footprints in the sand. They were small, too small for a grown man. Without a word, Thomas grabbed his revolver, checked the cylinder, and followed the tracks. The desert stretched endlessly before him, the sun climbing higher with every step. He moved quietly, his boots crunching softly on the dry earth. After half a mile, he spotted something moving between two large boulders. A figure, then another, smaller one. He raised his gun and stepped closer, his voice low but firm. "Come out," he said. No answer. Only silence. He took another step, his eyes fixed on the shadows, then slowly a woman appeared. Her clothes were torn and covered in dust. Her face was thin, her skin darkened by the sun, and her eyes deep with exhaustion. Behind her, a small boy, no older than 5, clung to her leg. In her trembling hands, she held a piece of dried meat from Thomas's bag. Thomas aimed his revolver at her chest. "That's mine," he said coldly. The woman froze, her breath quick and uneven. The child pressed closer to her, frightened. She looked at the cowboy's gun, then at his face. There was no fear of death in her eyes, only desperation. Thomas could tell from her features and dress that she was Apache. His jaw tightened. For years, settlers and tribes had fought across this land. He had seen raids, burned wagons, and lost friends in ambushes. Every man he knew carried his own anger about it. But standing before him now wasn't a warrior. It was a mother who hadn't eaten in days. He kept his voice steady. "Why'd you steal from me?" The woman swallowed hard. Her English was broken, but her words were clear. "My boy, hungry, no food, please." Thomas said nothing. The child's eyes were sunken, his ribs showing beneath his shirt. The woman looked like she could barely stand. She took a small, trembling step forward and whispered, "Spare me." "And I will serve you," Thomas frowned. "Serve me?" She nodded quickly, her voice weak. "I cook, I work." "You no kill, please." The desert wind blew between them, carrying the sound of her voice away. Thomas lowered his gun slightly but didn't holster it. He had seen liars before, people who begged one moment and stabbed you the next. But something in her tone felt real. He studied her. She wasn't young anymore. Her face showed hardship, not deceit. The child hid behind her legs, clutching her worn shawl. Thomas sighed and finally lowered his weapon completely. "Put it back," he said. The woman hesitated, then slowly placed the stolen meat on the ground. Her hands shook. She expected him to shoot her anyway. But instead, Thomas stepped forward, picked up the food, and tore it in half. He handed one piece back to her. "Eat," he said. She looked up, confused. "Eat?" he nodded. "You and the boy. Eat." Her lips parted slightly in disbelief, then she whispered, "Thank you." She took the food and gave it to her son first. The boy devoured it quickly, tears forming in his eyes as he chewed. The woman took only a small bite, watching Thomas with cautious gratitude. Thomas leaned against a rock, keeping his distance. "What's your name?" "Nita," she said quietly. "My boy, I'm Loma." "Nita," he repeated. "You shouldn't be out here." "Where's your tribe?" Her eyes darkened. "Gone, soldiers, came, burned village. We run." Thomas looked away, guilt prickling at the back of his mind. He had once ridden as a scout for the army during the Indian campaigns. He had seen things he didn't like to remember, villages in flames, families scattered. Now, years later, one of those survivors stood before him, starving and lost. He glanced at her again. You got nowhere to go? She shook her head. Nowhere. Thomas rubbed his beard, thinking. He couldn't just walk away. He was no saint, but leaving a woman and child to die in the desert wasn't something he could stomach. He sighed heavily. All right. You said you'll work? Yes, she said quickly. I clean, I cook. I help. Fine, you stay near the camp. No stealing again. You help me with the chores and I'll feed you and the boy. Deal? Nita nodded eagerly. Deal. Thomas picked up his gear and motioned for them to follow. As they walked back to camp, he noticed how weak she was. Each step looked like a struggle. He slowed his pace without saying a word. When they reached the camp, Nita sat beside the fire, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Thomas gave her a canteen of water. She drank carefully as if afraid to waste a drop, then handed it to her son. While she rested, Thomas cooked beans and coffee. The smell made the boy's eyes widen. When Thomas passed them each a tin bowl, Nita bowed her head slightly before eating. As they ate, Thomas studied them quietly. The child had a quiet strength in his eyes like his mother. Nita didn't complain or speak much. She ate slowly, grateful for every bite. When they were done, she gathered their dishes and began to wash them in the creek nearby without being told. Thomas watched her, a strange feeling growing in his chest. He couldn't explain it, but it wasn't pity. It was respect. That night, as the stars filled the dark sky, Thomas sat by the fire while Nita and her boy lay a few yards away. The flames danced in his eyes as he thought about what had just happened. He had almost pulled the trigger on her. 1 second of anger could have ended 2 lives. But instead he had chosen to spare her. And now, for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The desert was still around them, silent, endless, and harsh. But there was something new in the air. A quiet promise, a fragile hope. Nita looked toward the firelight and whispered softly, "Thank you, Cowboy." Thomas didn't reply. He just stared into the flames, his jaw set but his heart unexpectedly warm. Somewhere deep inside, he knew his life had just changed forever. As the wind moved through the canyons and the moon climbed high, 3 souls, once strangers, shared the same patch of desert ground, bound not by fear or law but by a single act of mercy. And though Thomas didn't yet know it, the woman he spared would one day repay him in ways that would change his story and his heart for good. The days that followed were quiet but strange for Thomas Blake. He had always been a man of habit. Wake with the sun, pack the camp, move the cattle, and rest when the stars came out. But now, with Nita and her little boy Loma near his fire, his days felt different. Nita kept her word. Every morning she rose before the first light touched the horizon. She gathered sticks, cleaned the camp, and started a small fire without being told. Thomas would wake to find the coffee pot ready and the air filled with the smell of corn cakes roasting on hot stones. At first, he didn't speak much to her. He wasn't sure what to say, and she wasn't sure how much English he would understand. But somehow they managed with short words, hand gestures, and quiet glances. When she cooked, he watched carefully. When he saddled the horse, she stood aside, waiting for his signal. She was always polite, careful not to anger him, as if afraid he might change his mind and send her away. But Thomas wasn't that kind of man. He had already decided, if she wanted to work and survive, she was welcome. Still, something about her unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him think. He had known many people on the frontier, some kind and some cruel, but none like her. She moved with grace even when she was tired. She never complained, not even when her hands cracked from washing clothes in cold water or when her feet blistered from walking long distances. One afternoon, as the sun blazed above the desert, Thomas noticed Loma sitting quietly near the fire, drawing in the dust with a stick. He crouched beside him and asked, "What are you making there, kid?" Loma looked up shyly. "Horse him," he said in a small voice. Thomas smiled. "Horse, that so?" The boy nodded, pointing toward Thomas's mare grazing nearby. "Pretty horse," Thomas chuckled. "Her name's Daisy. You like horses?" Loma nodded again, his eyes bright for the first time since Thomas had met him. Nita watched from a distance, her face softening at the sight of her son smiling. It had been a long time since she had seen that. Over the next few days, Thomas let Loma feed Daisy small handfuls of oats. The boy's laughter filled the air, light and innocent, a sound Thomas hadn't heard in years. He found himself smiling more often without realizing it. Nita noticed the change too. She began to relax a little, her movements less guarded. Sometimes, when Thomas fixed a broken saddle strap or cleaned his rifle, she would sit nearby sewing clothes or weaving small mats from dried grass. They didn't talk much, but silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. One evening, as the sky turned red and gold, Nita came to Thomas holding a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said softly. Thomas frowned. "What's that?" She unwrapped it to reveal a pouch made from tanned hide. It was simple but neatly sewn. "To keep your tobacco," she explained. Thomas turned the pouch in his hands, surprised. "You made this?" Nita nodded. "You give us food. I make gift." He looked at her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "Thank you, Nita. It's fine work." She lowered her eyes shyly, whispering, "I am glad." That night, after she and Loma had gone to sleep, Thomas sat by the fire turning the pouch over and over. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had given him something without wanting something in return. It felt strange, but good. The next morning, Thomas decided to test the woman's trust. "Nita," he said while packing his gear, "I'm riding to the canyon for water. You stay and watch the camp." She looked up quickly. "You go alone?" "Just for a few hours," he replied. "Keep the fire going. I'll be back by sunset." She nodded, though he could see worry in her eyes. When he returned later that day, dusty and tired, the camp was just as he had left it. The fire was burning low, the blankets neatly folded, and dinner was ready. He smiled quietly to himself. She hadn't run away. In fact, she seemed more settled than before. Over the next few weeks, they traveled together. Thomas had decided to take a shorter trail toward the nearby settlement to sell some cattle. Nita walked beside the wagon, carrying her son when he grew tired. Sometimes Thomas offered her a place to ride, but she always refused. "I walk," she would say with a small smile. During those long walks, Thomas began to notice how she saw the land differently. Where he saw rocks and dry bushes, she saw food and medicine. She showed him which roots could be boiled into tea for fever, which plants could clean wounds, and where to find sweet cactus fruit after rain. One day, while Thomas was fixing a loose wagon wheel, Nita disappeared for nearly an hour. He grew worried, thinking she might have wandered off or been taken by someone. But when she returned, her hands were full of bright red berries. "Eat," she said, handing them to him. "Good fruit." "No poison," Thomas laughed softly. "You sure about that?" She smiled for the first time, a small, warm smile. "I sure." He tasted one, and the sweetness surprised him. "You were right," he said. "Guess you know more about this land than I ever will." Nita's smile faded into something thoughtful. "This land my home long time. Before soldiers, before fences," Thomas didn't know what to say. He understood her pain, even if she didn't speak of it often. The world had changed, and not in her favor. But she carried her sorrow quietly, like someone who had learned to live with it. As days turned into weeks, their bond grew stronger. In the evenings, after Loma had fallen asleep, they would sit by the fire. Sometimes Thomas would hum old songs from the trail, and Nita would listen with her head slightly tilted, trying to catch the tune. Other nights she told small stories from her tribe, about the stars, the spirits, and the wind that carried voices from the mountains. Her English was broken, but her stories were beautiful. Thomas would listen, watching her face glow in the firelight, thinking she was far more graceful than anyone he had ever met. One evening, a desert storm rolled in suddenly. The wind howled through the canyon, whipping sand into their faces. Thomas hurried to secure the horses and supplies, while Nita pulled Loma into a small shelter she built from blankets and branches. When Thomas finally ducked inside, soaked in sweat and dust, Nita handed him a dry cloth. "You safe," she said simply. He nodded, catching his breath. The storm raged outside, but inside the small shelter there was warmth. Loma slept between them, his head resting on his mother's arm. Thomas watched the boy's peaceful face and then looked at Nita. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly. Nita looked into the flickering lantern light. "We all have," she answered. "But still we live." Thomas nodded slowly. "Still, we live," he repeated. When the storm passed and the stars returned, the world felt clean again. The desert, though harsh, had a strange beauty under the moonlight. Nita stepped outside and lifted her face to the cool breeze. Thomas watched her for a moment, realizing how much had changed since that morning he found her stealing from his camp. He had expected trouble, but instead he had found something else, something he couldn't yet name. She had brought peace to his lonely world without even trying. That night, as he lay on his blanket near the dying fire, he thought of her words again. "Spare me and I will serve you." But she had done more than serve him. She had reminded him what it meant to care, to protect, and to feel human again. He turned toward the stars and whispered to himself, "Maybe I didn't spare her. Maybe she spared me." Days passed into weeks, and soon, Thomas Blake could hardly remember what his camp had been like before Nita and her boy arrived. Their presence had changed the quiet rhythm of his life. The long, empty hours on the trail now carried voices, the gentle hum of Nita's songs, the laughter of Loma chasing grasshoppers, and the comforting sound of the pot boiling over the fire each evening. For the first time in years, Thomas felt that the silence around him was not heavy anymore. It was peaceful, but even in peace there were shadows. Sometimes at night, Thomas would wake to find Nita sitting near the fire, staring into the flames with a faraway look. Her face would soften, her lips moving slightly as if whispering to someone who wasn't there. He never interrupted her. He only wondered who she was remembering and what kind of sorrow she carried in her heart. One evening, after a long day of travel, they stopped near a narrow creek lined with tall mesquite trees. The air was cooler there, and the sound of running water brought a kind of calm to the camp. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in deep orange and violet, Thomas sat sharpening his knife while Nita prepared supper. She ground corn on a flat stone, her hands moving in slow, steady circles. Loma played nearby, tossing pebbles into the stream and counting the ripples. After a while, Thomas spoke softly. "Nita, can I ask you something?" She paused but didn't look up. "Yes," she said quietly. "You said your people were gone," he continued. "How did it happen?" For a long moment she didn't answer. The only sound was the gentle splash of the creek and the call of a night bird in the distance. Then, in a soft, trembling voice, she began to speak. "Long time ago," she said, "we live near river. My husband Tayo, he hunt. My brothers, they ride horses and trade skins for corn. We have big fire at night, many songs." Her eyes grew distant as if she could still see it all. "Then soldiers come. They say we must go. They say this not our land now." Thomas listened quietly, his knife still in his hand but forgotten. "They take our horses, burn houses. We run to mountains. My husband go back for his father. He never come back." Her voice shook, but she did not cry. "After that, I hide with my son. We walk many days. No food, no water. People die on the way. I find only wind and sand." She stopped grinding the corn. Her hands rested on the stone, and her eyes were wet in the firelight. "Then I find your camp," she whispered. "And I steal." "Because I had nothing left." Thomas's throat tightened. He looked at her and saw not just a tired woman, but someone who had lost her whole world and still found the strength to keep her child alive. "I'm sorry," he said softly. She looked up at him, surprised. "Why you sorry?" He hesitated, his voice low. "Because I was one of those men once. Not the same unit, maybe, but I rode with the army. I thought we were doing right, but maybe we weren't." Nita looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. The fire crackled between them. Finally she said, "The past is like wind. It go where it want. You cannot catch it." Thomas gave a small nod. Her words carried more wisdom than many books he had read. From that night on, something changed between them. The wall of silence that had once stood faded away. They began to talk more, not just about survival, but about life. Nita told him small stories from her childhood, how her mother taught her to find water by watching the birds, how her father said every stone had a spirit, and how she once dreamed of having a small garden near the river. Thomas shared his own memories, of his farm in Missouri before the war, of his mother's apple pies, and of the time he had left home at 16 to find adventure but found only loneliness instead. Their conversations were simple, but they filled the empty desert nights with warmth. One afternoon, Thomas noticed Nita sitting by the creek washing clothes. Loma played nearby, splashing water with his hands. The sunlight made Nita's hair shine like black silk, and for the first time Thomas realized how graceful she truly was. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living. When she caught him watching, she smiled faintly. "You look like man with many thoughts," she said. Thomas laughed softly. Maybe too many. What you think? She asked curiously. He hesitated. I was thinking how strong you are, Nita. Most folks would have given up a long time ago. She looked down at the water and said quietly, when you have someone to protect, you do not stop. You walk even when feet bleed. Her words touched him deeply. He thought of the countless nights he had sat alone, not caring if he lived or died. But Nita's courage reminded him that there was more to life than just surviving. It was about holding on to something worth living for. Later that evening, Thomas showed her how to use a small tool to mend leather straps. She watched closely, learning quickly. Her hands were steady and skilled. Soon she was repairing his saddle like she had done it all her life. You learn fast, Thomas said with a smile. Nita smiled back. Apache women strong. We learn what we must. From then on, they worked side by side. She cooked, he hunted, and little Loma followed them everywhere, learning from both. The boy began to call Thomas Tom, and sometimes, when Thomas wasn't paying attention, the child would place small stones in his hat as a game. One evening, after supper, Nita began to hum a soft tune. The melody was low and full of emotion. Thomas listened, leaning against a log. What's that song? He asked. It is a song for peace, she replied. My mother sing it when storm comes. She say wind listens. Thomas closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the night air. It was unlike any song he'd ever heard, gentle, haunting, and full of hope. When she finished, he said quietly, That's beautiful. Nita looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. You have sad eyes, Tom, she said softly. You carry heavy things, he smiled faintly. Maybe I do. You good man, she said simply. Desert, no. Child, no. I know. Her words warmed him more than the fire ever could. As days turned into another month, their trust deepened. Thomas began to see Nita not as someone he had rescued, but as someone who had rescued him in her own quiet way. His heart, which had long been locked away, started to open again. One night, while Loma slept under a blanket near the fire, Thomas and Nita sat watching the stars. The sky was clear, the desert air cool and still. Do you ever think about leaving this place? He asked. Nita shook her head. Where would I go? My home is gone. But here, she paused, glancing at him. Here we safe. Thomas nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. Safe. A long silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was the kind of silence shared by people who understood each other without needing many words. As the fire burned lower, Thomas thought about that morning when he had found her stealing from his camp. How close he had come to turning her away, or worse. He couldn't help but wonder what might have happened to her and Loma if he had made a different choice. Now, looking at the woman beside him, he knew that mercy had given both of them something precious, a second chance. The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying the faint sound of Nita's song once more. And as Thomas listened, he realized something. He no longer felt alone. The desert had always been a quiet place, but one late afternoon an uneasy feeling settled over Thomas Blake's camp. He noticed it first in the way the wind seemed to carry whispers across the rocks, though there were no people around. Daisy, his mare, shifted nervously, stamping her hooves as if sensing something approaching. Thomas squinted toward the horizon. At first it looked like distant dust in the sunlight, but as it grew closer, he realized it was a small group of riders. His heart tightened. They were not settlers or traders. There was a hard, focused look about them, the kind of look that spoke of trouble before it even arrived. He turned to Nita, who was gathering firewood. Stay calm, he said quietly, and keep Loma close. She nodded, her face set with determination, but her hands gripped the boy's shoulders tightly. Who they? She whispered. I don't know yet, Thomas replied, but we'll find out. The riders came closer, and Thomas could now make out their faces, stern, rough men, each carrying long rifles. They circled the small creek where Thomas had made camp, stopping a few 100 feet away. One of them, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat, called out in a loud, commanding voice, Hey, that Apache woman, you with that man? Step out! Nita froze. The color drained from her face. Loma clung to her, his small hands gripping her arm tightly. Thomas stepped forward, holding his hands low to show he meant no sudden harm. She's not causing anyone trouble, he said firmly. We're just passing through. You don't need to get involved. The tall man laughed, a cold, sharp sound that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. Passing through, huh? We've been sent to take her back. She's wanted for leaving the reservation. We can't let her go free. Nita's eyes widened. She whispered, They want to take me? Thomas's jaw tightened. Not while I'm here. The riders laughed again, the sound bouncing off the rocks. That's not your choice, cowboy. Step aside or there will be trouble. Thomas's hand hovered near his revolver, but he didn't draw it. Violence could come, yes, but he needed to protect Nita and her son without rushing into it blindly. You leave now, he said evenly. I don't want anyone hurt, but I won't let you take her. For a moment, no one moved. Then, without warning, one of the men rode closer, circling the camp. He was clearly testing Thomas, trying to see if he would fight or run. Thomas kept his eyes steady, refusing to flinch. Nita stepped closer to him, her voice trembling. Tom, what we do? We stay calm, he whispered. And we hide the boy first. Before the men could react, Thomas grabbed Loma and slipped him behind a natural wall of rocks. Nita followed, using her knowledge of the land to find small shadows and crevices where they could stay out of sight. Thomas remained near the center of the camp, standing in plain view, drawing attention to himself so the men wouldn't search further. The tall man sneered. I see you. Hand her over now. Thomas shook his head. Not going to happen. For several tense minutes, neither side moved. The desert seemed to hold its breath. Finally, the men decided to test him. 2 riders broke away from the group and began circling closer, their rifles ready. Thomas realized they intended to force him to act first. He had to think fast. Violence could put Nita and Loma at risk. He took a deep breath, then shouted, I said leave now or you'll regret it. The riders paused, startled by his sudden voice, and for a moment Thomas saw an opening. He kicked up a cloud of sand with Daisy, creating a dust screen that hid Nita and Loma. Then he darted behind a boulder, keeping his revolver low but ready. The taller man shouted, Cowboy, stand still. Thomas ignored him, using the rocks and uneven terrain to maneuver strategically. His heart pounded, but he focused on one thing, protecting Nita and her son. He couldn't let fear make him reckless. Meanwhile, Nita clutched Loma tightly, whispering softly to calm him. She kept her head down, listening as the men's horses stomped and their voices echoed. She thought quickly, remembering the small crevices she had seen on their journey. Places where people could hide in plain sight. They were small but enough to shield her child. Thomas kept moving, ducking behind rocks, shifting position. The men fired a few warning shots, but Thomas stayed out of reach, letting the rocks absorb the bullets. After what felt like hours, though it was only minutes, the riders seemed frustrated. They couldn't see the woman or her child. Finally, Thomas heard a rider call out, Let's go. We'll find her later. The group rode off, grumbling and kicking up dust. Thomas didn't relax immediately. He stayed behind the rocks for a long moment, listening until the sound of hooves faded completely. Then he exhaled slowly, feeling the tension leave his body in small increments. He emerged carefully, scanning the area. Nita and Loma were safe. The boy peeked out from behind his mother, his wide eyes full of wonder and relief. You okay, little one? Thomas asked, crouching near them. Loma nodded, holding tightly to his mother. Nita's eyes met Thomas's, and in that glance he could see the mixture of fear, gratitude, and respect. Thank you, Tom, she whispered. He shook his head. Don't thank me yet. We still need to be careful. That night, after the sun had set and the stars filled the sky, Thomas thought about the day's events. He realized how much he had come to care for Nita and her child. The thought of losing them, or of anyone else trying to take them, was unbearable. Nita stayed near him, talking quietly about the journey ahead. We must keep moving, she said. They will not forget us, Thomas nodded. Yes, we find safer trail, somewhere away from anyone who wants trouble. As they walked the next morning, Nita showed Thomas small paths and hidden spots that only she knew. They moved cautiously, taking long detours through canyons and behind hills. Loma followed closely, his small steps quick and careful. Days passed without incident, but the memory of the bounty hunters remained. Thomas knew that more could come, and he made sure the camp was always prepared. He taught Nita small ways to hide supplies, signal if danger approached, and keep Loma out of sight. The experience, though frightening, strengthened their bond. Nita's courage impressed Thomas every day. Even when faced with danger, she remained calm and focused, thinking not only of herself but of her child. Thomas admired her more than ever. One evening, while they rested near a quiet creek, Thomas finally spoke. "You know," he said, "I've seen a lot of people in my life. Some are brave, some are clever, but you are something else." Nita looked down, embarrassed. "I do what I must," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "Yes, and that's why you survive." For the first time, Nita laughed, a small, quiet sound. "You funny," she said. "Cowboy funny," Thomas chuckled. It was strange how fear, danger, and trust could all mix together. They had faced a serious threat, but in the end they had survived. Together. As the fire burned low that night, Thomas glanced at the sky. He knew the desert would always be full of dangers, storms, wild animals, or people who meant harm, but he also knew that he and Nita had found a strength in each other that nothing could break. And in the quiet moments, when the boy slept and the stars shone bright, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of family, of purpose, and of hope that went beyond mere survival. The desert was still vast, silent, and harsh. But for Thomas, Nita, and Loma, it had become something else, a place where courage, loyalty, and compassion had created a safe corner of the world just for them. The desert had quieted after the recent threats, but Thomas Blake knew that life here was never truly safe. Still, something had changed. He had found companionship, trust, and a purpose that he had never imagined possible. Nita and her son, Loma, were no longer strangers or guests. They were part of his world, part of the life he wanted to protect. One morning, Thomas rose with the sun and stretched, the air cool against his skin. He watched Nita and Loma gathering firewood near the creek. Loma ran ahead, laughing, his small feet barely touching the sand as he chased a lizard. Nita followed more slowly, carrying a bundle of sticks on her back, her face calm but alert. Thomas realized that even after all the dangers they had faced, she had never complained or lost her determination. Her strength was quiet but undeniable. He thought back to the first morning he had found her stealing from his supplies. She had been desperate, frightened, and alone. Now she was thriving, not because he had spared her, but because she had chosen to make a life even under impossible circumstances. He called to her. "Nita, come here for a minute." She turned and walked over, Loma skipping behind her. Thomas handed her a small piece of leather and some tools. "I was thinking," he said, "we could make a little shelter over near the creek, something strong enough to keep us safe from the wind and rain." Nita's eyes brightened. "We build together?" she asked. "Together," he confirmed. They worked side by side for the next few days. Thomas cut branches, shaped wood, and dug a small foundation, while Nita wove mats and tied the structure together. Loma helped in his own small ways, carrying stones or picking up sticks. Their laughter filled the air, a sound Thomas realized he had missed for far too long. When the shelter was finished, it wasn't grand, but it was strong. And it was theirs. Nita hung a small cloth inside to serve as a curtain, and Thomas added a simple wooden frame for the blankets. It became their home, a place where they could rest without fear, eat without worry, and simply be together. That evening, Thomas cooked over the fire while Nita sat beside him, peeling and cutting vegetables they had found near the creek. Loma played nearby, tossing small pebbles into the water and counting the ripples. The simple rhythm of life felt new and precious. "Tom," Nita said softly, "we safe now?" Thomas nodded. "For now," he replied. "And we'll stay safe as long as we look out for each other." She smiled faintly, the first real, easy smile he had seen from her in weeks. "I like this," she whispered. "Life small, but good." Thomas watched her, thinking about how far she had come, from a desperate woman stealing his food to a strong, capable partner who had taught him courage, patience, and hope. He realized that she had changed his life as much as he had changed hers. Over the following weeks, they began to make their small homestead more comfortable. Thomas carved wooden utensils while Nita made simple mats and blankets. Loma learned to tend to the small garden they planted, helping to water the few vegetables they could grow near the creek. The boys' laughter became the heartbeat of the place, filling the days with joy. As the sun set one evening, Thomas and Nita sat by the fire, the boy asleep under a blanket. Thomas spoke quietly, almost to himself. "You know, Nita, I never thought I'd have someone like this in my life. Not after all the years out here alone." Nita looked at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering firelight. "I know," she said softly. Life teaches hard, but we find people who care. It make life better, Thomas nodded. He realized she was right. He had survived the desert for years, relying only on his strength and skill. But real life, the kind worth living, was about more than survival. It was about connection, trust, and protecting those you cared for. Days turned into months, and the desert changed with the seasons. The scorching heat of summer gave way to cool autumn evenings, and the small homestead became a place of comfort for the trio. Travelers sometimes passed by, amazed to see a cowboy and an Apache woman working together, caring for a small child. Word of their courage, kindness, and unity spread quietly across the region, though Thomas never sought recognition. One evening, after a long day of gathering supplies, Thomas and Nita sat under a tree near the creek. Loma had gone to chase a rabbit and would return soon. Thomas handed Nita a small bundle he had prepared, a pouch similar to the one she had made for him months ago. "For you," he said. "I made it. Simple but useful." Nita's eyes widened in surprise. She held the pouch carefully. "For me?" she whispered. "Yes," Thomas replied. "To carry what you need, just like you helped me before." She looked at him, her face softening with gratitude. "You remember?" she said quietly. Thomas shrugged, a faint smile on his lips. "Of course I do. You've taught me a lot, Nita, about life, and courage, and hope." She smiled, a small, warm expression. "You teach me too," she said. "How to trust and live a new way." As the boy returned, laughing and holding a small bundle of wildflowers, Thomas realized how far they had all come. The desert that had once been harsh and lonely had become a place of life, laughter, and safety. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. That night, as they sat around the fire, Thomas looked at Nita and Loma and felt a sense of peace he had never known. The dangers of the desert still existed, but he knew that together they could face anything. He remembered the morning he had found her stealing from his supplies. How close he had been to walking away, or worse. How fragile life had seemed. And now, looking at them, he realized that moment had changed everything. Not just for her, but for him too. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd be happy out here alone. But now I am." Nita looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting the fire. "We make home," she said simply. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "We make home." The wind blew softly through the trees, carrying the faint scent of desert flowers and the sound of the creek nearby. Loma yawned and leaned against his mother, his small hand resting on hers. Thomas watched them, feeling a warmth in his chest he hadn't felt in years. The desert was vast, harsh and unforgiving, but in this small corner of it, they had found something rare and precious: safety, trust, and family. And it had all begun with a single plea: "Spare me and I will serve you." In the end, Thomas realized it wasn't just mercy that had saved them all. It was compassion, courage, and the choice to believe in each other, even when the world seemed determined to break them. The stars shone above, twinkling over the quiet camp. As the three of them settled into the night, they were tired but safe, and for the first time, Thomas felt certain of one thing: whatever the desert might bring in the future, they would face it together. And so, in the vast Arizona desert, a cowboy, an Apache woman, and her little boy built a life from trust, hope, and kindness. They had been strangers once, brought together by chance and necessity. But through courage, loyalty, and care, they became something more: a family, strong and unbroken, ready to face whatever the future held.